everybody see? Oh, can everybody see the presentation? Okay. All right, so this is an orientation to information management at the Jornada. As I said before, I'm the LTER information manager for the Jornada Basin. But this will apply to other Jornada data as well, besides just LTER data. So for this talk, I'm going to discuss the relationship between LTER and you as a researcher. We'll talk a little bit about best practices for collecting data. We'll talk about metadata, which is data that describes a data set. So the what, the why, the how of your data. And then we'll talk a little bit about some advanced topics in data analysis and management. And then I'll talk briefly about how to publish a data set. I'm going to go a little bit fast. As I said, you can always contact me using that email address. You can also see a lot of this on the Jornada IM website. And I'll try to make sure that these slides stay available in a variety of places. So the themes we're going to work around in this presentation are quality data and metadata. We're going to talk about open science and reproducible research. So these are hot topics in the ecological and environmental sciences. Accessible data, accessible methods and publications. Can other researchers confirm research results? We'll talk about community efforts and collaboration among research networks. So the LTER network and the Jornada Basin LTER is one of many other environmental or ecological research networks. And so we try to interoperate with those and collaborate with those. And another theme is data reuse. So we want data that we collect to be useful far into the future. And so a lot of what we do as researchers and as data managers is try to make sure that data sets don't get lost or information about them doesn't get forgotten over time. These are not fully realized ideals. So a lot of this is, a topic of debate, or we're trying to figure out the best practices for a lot of these things. But I'm going to kind of talk about how things are right now, and things do change every year, and there are new practices to be aware of every year. So LTER and you, the researcher. Oops. So the LTER program grew out of the International Biological Program, which ran from 1968 to 1974. There was an IBP site in the Jornada Basin, and there are still measurements ongoing at that site in the Jornada Basin today. The first LTER sites were funded by the NSF around 1980, and the Jornada Basin LTER was one of the early LTER sites funded in 1982. And so the LTER program is an early effort to understand the Earth and its living systems. And a lot of the value in the LTER network, and a lot of the reason why it was a cutting edge and still is a cutting edge network at the time, was that it sort of started this concept, or was one of the early adopters of the concept of collecting long-term data. So the whole idea behind the network was to observe ecosystems over a long period of time. And so now it's been running for about 40 years. So that's a pretty long time. And there are some very long data sets in the LTER network. One interesting fact about the LTER network is that it really was, and still is, at the leading edge of the open science movement. So the idea of sharing data and publishing data was a part of the network from early on, and some of the sort of earliest practices and infrastructure for sharing data and publishing data came out of the LTER network. So LTER data is open to current and future scientists, so scientists like you. It's also open to managers, policymakers, and the public. And like I said, it is one of many other data creation networks. So in the last several decades, data collection in ecology and earth systems has really grown exponentially. And when you do research as an ecologist or an earth scientist or an environmental scientist of some kind, a lot of the times you're drawing on research or data from a lot of networks. So for instance, we have a NEON site at the Jornada. We have some Ameriflux towers at the Jornada. It might be very common for you to want to find some remote sensing data from NASA in your research. And so we draw on a lot of data when we do modern research. And so interoperability and having a lot of metadata available to understand data from different sources is it's a key need and a key concern in doing research nowadays. And so we try to pay attention to that at the Jornada Basin LTER and the LTR network. So if you want to make the most of the LTR data you collect, there's a few things you can do. One is publish it. So write a great paper and publish the research that you do, publish the data behind it. But we want to share the data and the metadata that's behind your papers. So opening up your data and your research process, it really does help science. So you can really learn a lot from other researchers and data that other people collect. So opening up your research process and sharing your data, sharing your process, your workflow really helps science. It's pretty fun. You get to learn about a lot of cool tools and techniques to get your data out there. It is also required. So NSF requires that we make our data publicly available within 2 years of data collection in the LTR network. Other funding agencies are very similar. It also happens to be required, as I mentioned before, by journals. So if you want to publish your research, you also have to publish the data behind it in that journal article. So that's the case for ESA journals, which I'm sure many of you are interested in publishing in. It's the same for AGU journals. So you don't want to jealously guard your data like Smeagol here. You want to be a little bit more open and share your data. You obviously want to do that smartly as well and make sure you get credit for sharing your data. So the specific requirements that we have at the Jornada are that generally we do follow the LTR network data access policy. We ask that you submit your data and metadata to the Jornada IM team. So that's mainly so that we can keep in touch with you. We can kind of take a look at your data and metadata and make sure it's complete. And then we archive a copy of that data. And you can think of that as just another offsite backup for your research data so that you don't lose it. So we ask that you submit that data and metadata to us yearly. We have to publish that data and metadata at the time that research results are peer reviewed and published. So when you write a journal article, or no later than 2 years after collection. We're a little bit flexible about that with student data. So some of you are collecting data, from the first years of your PhD program, for example, and it might be 3 or 4 years or 5 years before you get the papers published. So we allow for that. But for our long-term data sets, we've got to get them out no later than 2 years after collection. In addition to that, we ask that you keep project information up to date in our database. So I mentioned we're creating this project database. We'll remind you about every year to kind of update the information that we have about your project. So if you're a PI or a grad student working on a long-running project, we're likely to reach out and ask you to tell us, who's working on that project, tell us about the publications that are coming out, that kind of thing. We also ask that you acknowledge Jornada support and data. So when you write an article, we want you, and you're an LTR student or PI, and you've gotten some funding from the LTR program, we ask that you acknowledge that support in your papers or in your dissertation or other publications. We also ask that when you use Jornada data, cite that. So put a citation in your paper for the data set that you used from EDI or from another repository. This link goes back to that For Researchers page on our website. You can always find more information there, all the appropriate links and all that stuff. If you have questions, there's a couple people you can talk to. Like I said, John Anderson, he's kind of our Jornada know-it-all. He's been around since the beginning of the LTR program, and he's the research site manager now. So he approves new LTR projects. He keeps track of the project information over years. He can even help with experimental design or locating good places to do research on the Jornada. I'm the information manager for the site. So I help with data curation and archiving, publishing that data. I'm also a resource for, just good practices for coding or data analysis and data management. And of course, you should talk to your PI if you're a student about, about questions about LTR data or research. So data collection best practices. As you collect data, there's a lot of things to think about. So data collection, it's really a process. So, for a lot of you, it's going to start in the field. You're going to be writing in a little yellow notebook, and then you might transcribe that into a spreadsheet and then analyze it from there. Start thinking about how to collect that data early on. So think about the type of data that you're collecting. Could your data be described as a tabular data set or something that'll fit into a table? Are you collecting images? Are you collecting a time series? Are you collecting in different experimental treatments? So really think about that data type and that data structure as you start, and how you want to enter and manage that data through the whole process. So tabular data types are probably the most common in ecology, although they're probably not the greatest volume. But basically a tabular data set is just a table, and you have variables and observations arranged in rows and columns. And most data can be represented this way, most ecological data in any case, but there are special cases. So it's more frequent to be collecting imagery data now. That could be photos from a phenocam, remote sensing data, UAV data. It's quite a bit more common to be collecting high frequency time series in a data logger. That could be happening at a flux tower or just a plain old weather station. We collect geospatial data more frequently now. We collect genomic data and sequencing data more frequently now. And so a lot of these may have unique structures and or file formats that you should think about. They may also have unique data publishing requirements. So for instance, genomic data is commonly going to go to NCBI, right? You still want to communicate with the Jornada IM team because we want to kind of keep track of those special case data and try to provide some access to those and potentially some metadata for those, even if they're not held at the EDI repository, which is the one we most frequently use. Also think about data structure, and that's going to depend on the type of data you're collecting. But for tabular data, it's going to include what variables are you going to be collecting, and is each one going to be represented as a column? What do your rows represent in your tabular data set? Are they observations, or are they laboratory analysis results? The best practice here is try to use the simplest possible data structure that you can. So if your data can be a simple table, that's the best thing to keep it in. Try to organize your data by observational unit during data collection, and try to maximize the information for every observation. So if you are making an observation, try to add extra information about it as you make those observations. So add, the time, the species, the as much granularity as you can with every observation and add that into your data table. I want to introduce the concept of tidy data. And so this is something that was popularized by Hadley Wickham. Here's a link to a journal article by him. And I think this quote comes from that paper, although I'm not sure about that. But it's often said that, 80% of data analysis is spent on the process of cleaning and preparing the data. And that's a lot of time. So there are things that you can do to make that a little bit easier. And so this tidy data concept is that, data can be arranged in different ways in your tables. And so in what's called wide form or untidy data, you may have observations and variables in both the rows and the columns. So this is a wide form, two wide form tables, and that data can be presented in two ways. So you can have, you can see here that we have treatments as columns in one table, you have treatments as rows in another table, and you've got observations that can either be in the rows or the columns there. This is the same data arranged in what's called long form or tidy data form. And every column represents a variable and every row represents an observation. So in data analysis these days, you're going to see kind of the preference for tidy data or long form data more often. There are times when you want to use wide form data. Sometimes, it's a lot easier with some statistical analyses that you're going to do, but probably for collecting and keeping your data, shooting for long form is not a good, or is not a bad idea. It's generally sort of preferred these days. Here's a few data no-nos. Here's a table that's a bad example on the lower left and a table that's a better example on the lower right. It's best practice to not aggregate variables into one column. So for instance, this column B that you see in the table on the left has treatment, plot, and individual, I believe, all kind of hyphenated, concatenated together into one column. It's better to be granular. So put your treatments into one column, your blocks into another column, and your individuals identifiers into a third column. Make your variable names descriptive. So var1 and var2, it's not really easy to tell what those variables are. So give them something that sounds like what the data are, like plant height or plant width. And also don't forget a missing value indicator and describe what that actually means. So we have some blank cells here in this table, and it's hard to know if that was an observation that wasn't made or one that went missing later. Maybe there wasn't a plant in that location on the transect. So it's really kind of hard to tell what that is. So when you collect your data, put in a missing value indicator, and it's probably good practice to describe what that missing value means. So have a comment field or something like that that tells you what those missing values actually signify. File formats. Sometimes, so the file format is the actual file type that is stored on your computer containing your data. And so sometimes that is specific to data type. So for instance, if you're collecting imagery, you might be collecting JPEG files or PNG files. If you're just collecting tables, you could use Excel files or you could use CSV files. But some of these file formats are more accessible and versatile than others. So I strongly recommend that you consider just putting, if you have tabular data, just put it in a delimited text file like a CSV file or a comma separated value file. Those can often be a lot easier to use than an Excel file because Excel changes, and if you've ever opened up a really, really old Excel file, you can have some problems opening them up. So Your file formats should probably also encourage data reuse. So try to make them simple and easy to understand. So you can see a bad example here where we have tables within tables. We've got some metadata that's kind of mixed in, and things are kind of separated into different subtables and columns and stuff. So this is a complicated Excel spreadsheet that probably only the person that created it could understand. So if you want to share your data and publish it, you want to look for a simple format and a simple file type. So yeah, simple data structures and file formats will work with a variety of tools. You won't have to have a special platform to analyze the data or anything. They make data analysis and interpretation easier. It's a lot easier to publish these. So one of the things that I spend my time on when I have to publish a data set or help somebody publish a data set is trying to reformat an Excel sheet. If you are submitting data in Excel sheets, a lot of the time that has to be shifted around and made into a simple, tidy format to publish on EDI. And so if you do that ahead of time, it'll be a little bit smoother road to get your data into the repository that you need to submit to. They're also easier to describe with metadata. So it's easier to just give a series of column descriptions than to give metadata about multiple sheets or tables within sheets in an Excel sheet, for example. And finally, protect the data that you collect. So back up all your raw data immediately. We ask that you submit your data to us yearly, and so you can consider that another backup, and we'll help you get your data backed up. Once you do have your raw data saved, first of all, I would make a copy of it if you're going to do any QA/QC and keep the raw data, and document any data edits that you make after data collection. So any QA/QC that you do later on after you collect the data, keep a journal of that or a README file about that, and collect any appropriate metadata that you think you're going to need right away. So that could be locations in the field, times that you're doing the data collection, people that are with you, all of that sort of stuff. So let's talk more about metadata. Metadata is data about data. And so without it, the usable information content declines over time. So you can see that we have a publication happening at a certain time. And if you don't have metadata keeping track of the specific details about that data, the actual information content of your data set decays over time. So you might lose specific details first, like what time of day did I make this observation? More general details come later. Over time, people change, the people managing the data change, and they may lose information about a data set as well. So this is a natural process of information decay, and we try to avoid that by keeping a lot of good quality metadata with our data. So like I said, it is data about the data. So what was collected, where was it collected, when, who collected it, how did they collect it, and why? So this allows us to reuse our data. So in our Jornada IM system, the general process of publishing data and metadata kind of looks like this. This is you, the scientist, and what you produce in your research are data files and metadata files. What I do is help you make a specially formatted metadata file called EML, or ecological metadata language files. And then I publish the data file, your data file, and your EML file to the EDI repository. So as you collect metadata, collect everything that is needed to accompany your data file. If you can make it machine readable, that's a plus, but I'm the one who's going to help you get it into this EML format in general. So I can kind of take care of the machine readable format if you need it. But basically what you want is descriptive content about your data in a standardized format. I'm going to go through these a little quick because I'm worried about time here, but basically you want to know in your metadata, you want to document what's being measured and observed. So what are all your variables, their names, their units, what are the missing values, and what do the observations represent? So what's the information you need about rows and columns in your table? Where and when were the data observed? So geographic coordinates and the temporal range, start and end dates. How was the data collected and by and for who? So describe your methods in your metadata. That could be your instruments, your field or lab methods, QA, QC, or the calculations that you did to get a derived data value. Who collected it, who has rights, all of that stuff is important. And yeah, think about anything else. So your abstract, your metadata abstract can tell us why the data was collected, keep track of related publications and data sets, and really kind of think deeply about what you need to understand your data set down the road. And think about this as not just you, but people might want to use your data decades or even longer, maybe even after you're dead. So try to collect that information now so that people can use your data far into the future. And I would say don't worry too much about the metadata format. We have some templates you can use, but the format is flexible. The important thing is keep your metadata and your data collect together. So if you have a project folder with a bunch of data, keep the metadata in there as well. You don't want to lose track of that metadata. A couple of advanced topics in data analysis and management. Sometimes data analysis and our research workflow gets pretty complicated. So you might, you might fill up your yellow notebooks. You might have a very complicated workflow to generate a research result. You might use, what's called big data. You might be doing machine learning, or you might be using big databases of species or things like that, or complex models. You might be writing lots of code or using very complicated Excel sheets to analyze your data. So when things get complicated, you might need to think a little bit more deeply about your data management. So here's an example workflow. Over here we have your project directory, and you've got some metadata files like an abstract, a methods, some other stuff. You've got some data files that come from the Jornada long-term data sets, perhaps. And then you've got a data cleaning script, and you create sort of a derived data file. You might have a gap filling script because you need to have gap filled data for a model that you need to run. And then you have a model, say it's a machine learning model, and it's probably got a bunch of specifications that you need to keep track of. Maybe you're bringing in ancillary data like remote sensing data sets from NASA. And then you have a bunch of data visualization scripts that are what create the figures to put in your publication. So there's a lot of steps there, a lot of code, a lot of data files. How do you document and keep track of all that? And also, what are you going to publish out of that? Do you publish all of this? Do you just publish the raw data? Do you need to publish the data that's behind the figures, which is maybe not that similar to the raw data? So I would just give you a few rules of thumb here. Publish the rawest data that another scientist might use. So yeah, do try to publish the raw data. You also want to publish data that is behind new research results. So if you have fancy new figures in your paper, then you probably want the data behind those figures as well. You want to include metadata with all the data that you publish. And you probably also want to consider publishing the analysis code and the documentation for that code as well. So there are some intermediate products in this workflow that can just be described by the code or the metadata. So if you have a QA/QC script and an intermediate file, or maybe a few intermediate files before you have your finished data that you put in the paper, sometimes you can just include the code or the metadata and not necessarily those intermediate files. Anyway, our ultimate goal here is reproducible research. So ask yourself a couple of questions. When you're done with your paper and you're publishing your data sets and all of that together, can another researcher independently verify your results? And could you go back in 5 or 10 years and understand the analysis that you did and recreate it? Then you want to write the documentation that you need to be able to answer those questions, yes. You want to comment, organize, and publish any analysis or visualization code if you can. So this makes your life a lot easier down the road as well. You might want to, it's going to make data publishing easier and publishing your paper easier. And then if you want to revisit the analysis and add things later, that's going to be a lot easier as well. Couple tips about keeping good documentation. This starts in the field or the lab. You want to keep an electronic copy of any handwritten notes, keep a data analysis log, and try to document kind of like a software engineer. So keep a documents directory in your project, and yeah, document every function and script. I think we'll kind of skip over this, but there are some things you want to learn about writing good code, like using functions, loops, and other language conventions. Consider using literate programming approaches. So this is a Jupyter notebook, and there are similar tools in R, like R Markdown notebooks. And so these put together documentation like formatted text, and your code and the outputs from your code like figures and statistics into one nice formatted document. And so you can revisit this and really understand your research workflow far down the road. And these are also shareable on GitHub, which is really nice. You also want to track how your project changes. You might want to consider using a version control system to do that. So Git is a great version control system. There's also Mercurial and Subversion and lots of others. But consider learning one of those and using it to version your analysis or visualization code. You can also version your documentation alongside your code. And these integrate really well with collaboration and project management systems, including things like GitHub and Bitbucket. So, and you might also ask that question, what's publishable in these complex workflows? And there's a lot, it depends on your data, but definitely critical code. If you're running models, you might want to keep track of parameter files, model state, model outputs. And then you also want to keep track of the data that you're bringing in, like ancillary data. So if you're using remote sensing data that you got from NASA, keep a DOI for that. And keep that information in your metadata. And like I said, I'm always here, or the others in the IM team are always here for you to ask. So reach out to us. Okay, so again, what should you publish? If you're unsure, just ask us. When you end up, when you're kind of finished with your analysis or ready to publish your analysis, you'll probably have a whole bunch of metadata files. You'll have a whole bunch of code. You'll have a whole bunch of data files. You might have some other stuff in there. This is the time to kind of reach out and start asking questions about what am I going to publish with my paper? What data files, what code, what metadata? We have resources and time to help you. So again, you can go to our For Researchers webpage. We have some metadata templates there, as well as contact info. We have a lot of guidelines and requirements on submitting and publishing your data at site. We also have a little bit more detailed information at these Jornada IM pages. If you want to know about some of our metadata standards or suggested keywords for your data, things like that, we have those there. And then we have full documentation on our IM system, which is definitely a work in progress, but yeah, if you're interested in that, it's there. And really the IM team is going to help you. So this is our process again. You're collecting the data and doing the research here. The IM team will help you. We can help you QC your data file to get it ready for publication. We can help you create a publishable metadata file, an EML file. You have to collect the metadata that goes into it, but we'll help you make this machine readable file. And then we'll help you, and we'll basically do it for you. We'll publish all of this to EDI. We can have you, if you want to learn this process of making EML and publishing to EDI, we can teach you that. But in general, it's kind of our job to handle that for you, and that's what we get paid to do. So, so you focus on the data and the metadata mostly, and making sure that we get that, and then we can kind of handle it from there. And we'll work with you on revising things. But oops. Okay, so just to summarize, LTR is committed to data sharing and reuse, and you should commit to that too. You really want to think about how to collect quality data and also metadata as you're doing your research. And then keeping good documentation, good versioning, like versioning your code is going to help you down the road, especially if you're in that category of kind of doing a pretty complex analysis. And the Jornada IM team is here to help you. So we'll help you package up and QA/QC your data and your metadata and publish it for you. So please reach out with any questions.